Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Ethan met Victoria when she was still in her second year of business school. He'd been invited to give a talk on sustainable entrepreneurship and explain how recycling could impact a city's economy. While answering questions at the end of the lecture, he noticed a young woman in the back of the room with sharp eyes and a determined expression. After that day, she started showing up at industry events and approaching him with increasingly technical questions. Victoria was ambitious and open about her dreams. She said she wanted to work in investments and change the financial landscape for companies ignoring environmental impact. Ethan was drawn not just to her beauty, but to her hunger to grow. At the time, he already owned 2 companies and lived comfortably. Over time, their connection deepened, and he decided to help her reach her goals. He paid for an extension course in finance in Boston, covered the costs of her exchange program, and kept her apartment in the city center while she studied. Victoria never asked for anything, but she never refused help either. She said it was just until she got on her feet that she'd pay him back with double the gratitude. Ethan believed her. He came from a family that always valued collective effort. To him, investing in someone he loved felt natural. He never imagined that this woman, who claimed to love his simplicity, would later use that very trait as ammunition. When she returned from her studies, she landed a job as a junior analyst at one of the country's largest investment firms. Slowly, she began getting promoted. Ethan was always by her side, celebrating every achievement, marking every milestone with gifts. They lived together, shared household decisions, and planned a future with children. At least, that's what he thought. Over time, the conversations changed. Victoria used to call several times a day. Then she started replying with 1 or 2 words. When they were home, she'd rather watch series alone in the bedroom than have dinner with him. Ethan began to feel something was off, but he tried to stay calm. He preferred to believe she was just tired. She worked in a demanding field. One night, while he was preparing dinner, she came home from work with her phone to her ear and didn't even take off her shoes. She walked through the house whispering, went into the bathroom, and locked the door. Ethan heard muffled laughter, then silence. When she came out, he asked if everything was okay. She said it was a work call, that the firm's new partner was really funny. He pretended to believe her. The next day, he decided to check his wife's Instagram, something he rarely did. Victoria had always been private. In her close friends gallery, there were photos of her on a rooftop at an event he didn't even know had happened. In one picture, she smiled next to a man in a dark suit, his hand discreetly resting on her back. It was Daniel Reeves, one of the partners at her company. In the days that followed, Ethan tried to observe more, but without causing conflict. He made a point of waking up early, making coffee, leaving flowers on the table. But Victoria seemed increasingly impatient with simple gestures. She complained about the smell of food, about his questions about her day, and eventually about Ethan himself. During one dinner, she said she needed someone who challenged her intellectually. She said she admired what he'd built, but that the world was changing. He didn't respond. He just listened. After that night, he started sleeping in the guest room, claiming he'd been snoring too much. Victoria accepted without protest. Days passed, and indifference turned to coldness. Ethan came home from work to find the house empty. Victoria spent entire weeks at events, trips, and dinners with colleagues. He began to feel something worse than sadness, uselessness. Like someone who had once been essential now seemed like a burden. The breaking point came one Sunday morning when he tried to talk to her about taking a vacation together. She laughed and said his world had room for breaks, but hers didn't. She added it wasn't fair for him to drag her into a mediocre life just because he'd already found the peace she was still chasing. That hurt. More than criticism, it was a direct attack on what he was most proud of, building something solid, clean, and honest. Ethan decided to stop trying to be the perfect man for her. Not out of anger, but out of dignity. He began to notice every detail, every gesture, every absence. He mentally logged times, words spoken, clothes changed before she left. He didn't feel paranoid, he felt clear. Something was being orchestrated behind the mask of the perfect executive. A plan where he was the only one who hadn't yet realized his role. At that moment, what had once been love turned into survival instinct. The firm's annual dinner was announced weeks in advance, but Victoria only mentioned it to Ethan 2 days before the event. She handed him the invitations on the kitchen table while eating a slice of whole wheat bread with jam and said the CEO wanted spouses present. She claimed Ethan's presence would bring balance to her image, as if he were a public relations accessory. He pretended interest, said he'd go, that it had been a while since they'd gone out together. Inside, he'd already decided what he'd do that night. He would be there, but not as a passive companion. He'd watch everything. Listen with his eyes. Read her lips with the same precision he once used to interpret international negotiations when consulting for companies in conflict with local governments. On the day of the event, Ethan chose a simple outfit. He looked elegant but unobtrusive. His goal was to be invisible enough to move around without drawing attention, yet still fit in with the other guests. They arrived together by car. Victoria looked radiant. She made a point of holding his arm in front of photographers, smiling widely at colleagues, and introducing her husband as an entrepreneur in the sustainability sector. The tone she used varied depending on the group. Sometimes it sounded like pride. Other times, like an excuse. Ethan noticed it all. Every glance she exchanged with Daniel, every stifled laugh when he stepped away to get something. During the cocktail hour, Ethan didn't move around much. He stayed within her line of sight but didn't interfere with her interactions. When he saw Victoria head toward the bar, he took the chance to get there first. He arrived before her, ordered 2 drinks, one of which he'd hand to her, and watched the bartender prepare them, mentally noting the ingredients. Minutes later, Victoria appeared beside him with a controlled smile, like she'd practiced it in the mirror. She took the glass from Ethan's hand, thanked him, and then someone called her from across the room. She walked away holding both glasses. Ethan stayed still, observing the movement. He went to a table and sat down alone. A short while later, she returned with both glasses, handed one to him casually, and said, "Try this. I think it's better now." He took it, discreetly studied the liquid, and took a sip. Nothing strange in taste, but there was a faint bitterness at the back, too subtle to be accidental. He stored the information. He kept the glass in his hand, alternating between sipping and pretending to sip. Meanwhile, Victoria was talking with Daniel in the center of the room. They laughed, looked at each other more than appropriate, then stepped slightly away from the crowd. Ethan, pretending to look at his phone, kept his eyes on Daniel's lips. He began reading the movements. Daniel asked if he'd taken it all. Victoria replied, "Yes. I just gave him the glass. If he passes out in half an hour, it's done." Daniel laughed and said the room was already booked. She added, "I just want him to pass out quickly." Ethan felt his stomach freeze. Since childhood, he'd had the habit of watching what people said from a distance. His neighbor from the house next door, a retired CIA agent, used to spend afternoons on the porch with him, teaching lip-reading tricks to distract his mind and train focus. Back then, it seemed like just a game, but over time it became a real skill he refined on his own. And now, in that room full of masks and raised glasses, he used it to see what many ignored. The betrayal he was witnessing wasn't just marital. It was a cold plan, an attack disguised as a slip-up. But losing control there would hand them the spotlight. He pretended weakness, leaned his arms on the table, closed his eyes for a few seconds, and tilted his head as if the world were spinning. He let some of the drink spill onto the floor, soaking his pants. He dropped the glass carelessly and muttered that he'd drunk too fast. When someone approached offering help, he thanked them and said he just needed fresh air. He stood up and headed for the exit, carrying in his chest a mix of poison in his blood and silent fury. Victoria saw him leaving and started to follow, but Daniel grabbed her arm and whispered something Ethan couldn't catch. He left the room without looking back. Outside, he started the car and turned on the air. His head was spinning. His vision doubled for a few seconds. He needed to get out of there. The worst thing that could happen was being found unconscious at that event. He didn't want the story shaped by her and Daniel. He drove slowly, trying to stay conscious. He knew time was short. The sedative was taking effect. He thought about stopping at a gas station or hospital, but every turn was a battle. His body felt heavy, his arms trembled. When he realized he was losing control, he tried to reach for his phone. Everything went dark. The car veered off the road and crashed through the roadside vegetation. In that moment, there was no anger. Only fear. Not for himself, but for everything he still needed to say, everything he still needed to prove. Ethan lost consciousness with one thought repeating like a mantra: they wouldn't win. The last sound he heard was his own heart beating like an erratic drum before he blacked out. The car left the road, plowed through a stretch of bushes, and stopped, tilted, caught between branches and mud. The crash was severe enough to draw attention. A passing driver slowed down at the sight of the dented body and headlights still on at a strange angle. He stopped, got out, and upon approaching, saw Ethan unconscious, forehead sweating, eyes half open, as if trying to wake from a nightmare. He called emergency services immediately. The ambulance arrived quickly. Paramedics placed him on a stretcher, performed initial procedures, and rushed him to the nearest hospital. Ethan woke hours later, surrounded by muffled voices, beeping sounds, and a bright light above him. His body felt heavy, but his mind was starting to return. He forced his breathing, blinked several times, and murmured a single sentence: "I want to speak with the police." The nurse beside him tried to calm him, but he insisted. He said he'd been drugged and that this wasn't an accident. She called the supervisor, who immediately contacted security. A police officer arrived minutes later with a notepad. Ethan told everything in a weak but firm voice. He explained where he'd been, who he was with, and what happened before he left. The officer listened in silence and said they'd need evidence to proceed. Ethan requested a full toxicology test. He wanted to know what was in his blood. And more than that, he wanted it documented in an official report. While waiting for the results, Ethan called his lawyer and relayed part of what happened, without going into details about lip reading. He asked him to prepare a request for a restraining order and to activate the car's cameras, installed months earlier as part of a pilot project for vehicle security monitoring. The lawyer said he'd handle everything. The footage was extracted but inconclusive. The route showed signs he was impaired and that the accident resulted from loss of consciousness. Nothing more. The key would be the toxicology report. The next morning, the results came back. The report showed the presence of a hospital-grade sedative in a quantity sufficient to knock out an adult for several hours. The attending doctor said that if the full dose had been ingested, the consequences could have been fatal. The substance wasn't available in pharmacies. It was controlled, restricted use. That changed everything. Ethan requested an authenticated copy of the results, signed and registered, and handed it personally to the investigator in charge. During the interview with detectives, Ethan got straight to the point. He said he suspected Victoria and a man named Daniel, one of the partners at her company. He explained they showed unusual intimacy during the company dinner, that she had insisted he drink a cocktail, and shortly after, he began experiencing strange symptoms taking over his body. The detectives asked many questions, especially about how he knew they were plotting something. Ethan hesitated for a moment. He knew the information would sound too strange, but he decided to tell the truth. He said he'd learned lip reading as a child, thanks to a retired neighbor who had been a CIA analyst for over 2 decades. Old Buck, as everyone called him, lived alone and used to spend afternoons with Ethan teaching observation tricks, silent reading, and behavioral analysis. Back then, it seemed like just a spy game, but it stayed with him. Over the years, he refined the skill, never imagining he'd one day use it to save his own life. With that clarified, the detectives began to take his testimony more seriously. They no longer saw a suspicious husband seeking attention, but someone observing with precision. They asked him not to discuss anything with third parties, to avoid media and social networks. Ethan agreed. He wanted the facts to speak for themselves. Before the team left the room, one officer returned with an update. A woman had come to the police station late the previous night. She said she had something important to report about the dinner. This woman was Helen, the widow of a former director at the investment firm. During the event, she had been seated near the bar and noticed Victoria alone, tampering with a freshly prepared drink. She found the gesture odd and almost mentioned it, but dismissed it as a common eccentricity in that circle. Only when she heard about Ethan's accident and rumors that he might have been drugged did she connect the dots and decide to speak up. Her testimony was detailed, clear, and consistent. She described Victoria's outfit, the approximate time, and how she looked around before touching the glass. With this, Ethan's version stopped sounding suspicious and gained solid footing. The investigation gained momentum. As soon as he learned of the new evidence, Ethan's lawyer didn't waste time. He filed an urgent motion requesting the seizure of Victoria's belongings and the freezing of joint accounts. He argued that, given the evidence, there was a real risk of evidence destruction or improper asset movement. The on-duty judge approved the request. Police searched the couple's home and seized Victoria's phone and laptop, along with a personal agenda locked in her desk drawer. Everything was catalogued and sealed. The quiet attempt to remove Ethan from the game was now making headlines. What seemed like a simple traffic accident had turned into a judicial scandal, with medical reports, witnesses, and concrete evidence. In the days that followed, Ethan remained under observation in the hospital. With each new update, he felt he'd narrowly escaped. His body was recovering, but his soul was still trying to make sense of it all. It was impossible not to think of the times Victoria said he was predictable, that he lived in a small world, that he didn't know how to reinvent himself. And now here he was, survivor of a cowardly plot, about to expose everything. The pain of being betrayed by someone you love is devastating. But discovering that same person wanted you gone is a wound that crosses every emotional boundary. Ethan didn't want pity or headlines. He wanted answers, accountability, and truth. He was ready to go all the way. And deep down, he knew there was still much more to be revealed. What started as suspicion was now heading toward something much bigger. He was ready to face it. The case gained momentum when forensic analysis of the electronic devices revealed messages between Victoria and Daniel dated before the dinner. The conversations left no doubt their relationship had gone beyond professional long ago. In addition, there were parts showing Daniel's frustration with how long Ethan was still holding on. In one message, Victoria wrote, "The day after tomorrow, he sleeps. The rest is ours." Prosecutors included these excerpts in the investigation and formally charged them with attempted qualified homicide. The news spread fast. The scandal stopped being a whisper in financial circles and became front-page news on specialized sites, news portals, and business forums. Victoria was summoned to testify. She showed up with a criminal defense lawyer known for representing public figures in sensitive cases. During questioning, she denied everything. She claimed Ethan was paranoid, had jealousy issues, and was fabricating a story to get revenge after the marriage fell apart. She tried to portray herself as a victim of a controlling man who, feeling he was losing ground, invented an absurd theory. Daniel, on the other hand, exercised his right to remain silent. The defense believed that if Victoria held firm in her denials, they could create reasonable doubt in court. The problem was that the evidence contradicted it all. Besides the incriminating messages, a water bottle with traces of the same sedative found in Ethan's blood was discovered in Daniel's office drawer. The lab confirmed the substance and strengthened the link between them. When her lawyers learned this, they changed strategy. They told their client that if she kept denying it with such clear evidence, she'd face the maximum sentence. That's when she gave in. She approached prosecutors and offered a deal. She'd accept partial responsibility and name Daniel as the mastermind. In court, the room filled with curious onlookers, journalists, and market analysts who knew Victoria as a rising star. Ethan, physically recovered, attended every hearing, always silent, eyes fixed ahead. When Victoria was called to testify, she took a deep breath and admitted yes, she was emotionally involved with Daniel, and under his pressure, agreed to help sedate Ethan during the event. She said she believed the sedative would only knock him out for a few hours and that she never intended serious harm. Prosecutors countered with medical reports showing the dose was potentially lethal. Daniel was caught off guard by the confession. When he learned he'd been named as the one who came up with the plan and supplied the substance, his defense collapsed. They tried arguing Victoria was shifting blame to save herself. But the messages, the evidence, and the sudden change in the former lover's stance weakened any defense. Faced with this, the judge ordered immediate preventive detention. Daniel was handcuffed inside the courtroom. The scene went viral. One of the most respected faces of the financial elite was now accused of plotting to poison his lover's husband to secure freedom and power. The verdict came weeks later. Daniel received 15 years in closed custody. Victoria, for cooperating and confessing, received 5 years in semi-open custody, plus a fine and the loss of all assets acquired in the past 2 years, considered proceeds from irregular financial movements. Her name was removed from the firm's board, she was expelled from the council, and banned from holding leadership roles in any registered U.S. financial institution for the next 10 years. Ethan left the courthouse in silence. He refused all interviews. His lawyer, when approached, only confirmed the divorce had already been finalized and all couple-owned properties had been legally transferred to Ethan. The shares Victoria had accumulated in his name while they were married also returned to him. A complete turnaround. The man who nearly got erased was rebuilding with everything. The case sparked debates in law schools, TV programs, and forums on human behavior. People who once thought he was too simple for her now recognized his calm, intelligence, and dignity through everything he'd endured. Those who once looked down on his simplicity now looked at him with admiration. The man who recycled trash and turned scrap into profitable projects was the same one who, facing an attempt at destruction, recycled pain into courage and built a new path over the ruins of what remained. The scandal damaged the firm's reputation, and its stock plummeted in the following months. Investors pulled out, clients broke contracts. The market, harsh toward ethical scandals, turned its back on her as if she'd never existed. During one of the final hearings, as Victoria was escorted to the side door of the courtroom, she locked eyes with Ethan. For the first time, there was no arrogance. Only shame. She said nothing. Neither did he. He simply held her gaze long enough for her to understand that from this point on, every decision they made had led them exactly here. It wasn't revenge. It was consequence. A story that began with love had turned into a chain of wrong choices, where each had to face what they'd sown. And Ethan, who had nearly been buried alive by a cowardly plan, now emerged before everyone as the man who survived the dirtiest betrayal anyone could endure. Ethan Cole's name began circulating in an unexpected way. He, who had always avoided the spotlight despite owning one of the country's most profitable recycling networks, was now being sought by media outlets, publishers, and documentary makers. They wanted to hear his side, the man who survived a murder attempt orchestrated by his own wife. They offered book deals, reality show invites, exclusive TV interviews. Some promised million-dollar contracts for him to tell everything, detail by detail. He turned down every offer. The only exposure he accepted was his courtroom testimony, and even then, with minimal emotion. Ethan believed dignity wasn't measured in audience size or trending topics. He used the following months to reorganize his companies and take full control of the assets he'd recovered. He made strategic decisions that further increased his stock value. He expanded the company's reach into education, creating technical training centers for youth in underserved areas, teaching principles of reuse, logistics, and sustainable entrepreneurship. He wanted to show that even what the world called waste could become a beginning. That's how it was with trash, and that's how it was with his own life. He rebuilt himself on the very things they tried to destroy. Many expected him to fall into a cycle of extravagance, buy a new sports car, a Manhattan penthouse, show up at business events with a woman 20 years younger. Ethan did exactly the opposite. He returned to the same house he'd lived in before marriage, in a quiet part of the state. He renovated it using sustainable and recycled materials from his own factories. He set up a functional office where he worked remotely and hosted trusted partners. The rest of his time he dedicated to reading, gardening, and caring for the dogs he'd adopted during recovery. He wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing peace. During this time, some people who'd once ignored him began reaching out again. College friends, financial sector contacts, even ex-girlfriends. They all showed up with praise, saying they always knew he was different. He listened politely, but didn't reconnect. He realized sometimes the world only recognizes someone's worth after they've bled in public. So he closed himself off to shallow relationships and opened up to greater causes. He founded a nonprofit in his father's name, focused on supporting men facing emotional or psychological abuse, something rarely discussed, but which he believed needed serious attention. At a private event on social innovation, Ethan was invited to give a talk. The audience was made up of young entrepreneurs and small investors. During his speech, he shared parts of his journey, avoiding scandalous details. He focused on the idea that a person's value should never be defined by packaging. He said that for years, he allowed someone to treat him as inferior just because the corporate world didn't value hands that worked with trash. He ended his speech with a simple line that brought instant silence to the room: "After everything I've been through, I can say this with peace, none of the women who showed up afterward were investment executives." The audience laughed, but there was a deeper layer to that line. It was more than irony. It was a message to those who trade loyalty for status, who fall for numbers and forget character. After leaving the event, he declined the cameras waiting outside. He greeted the organizers, said his goodbyes calmly, and drove away in his own car, a vintage model he'd restored at his company's workshop. Days later, he received anonymous letters, emotional messages, videos from men and women thanking him for giving voice to a pain many hide. People who'd been betrayed, deceived, silenced. Ethan realized his story, though painful, had become a bridge for others to cross their own deserts. Victoria continued serving her sentence in semi-open custody. She was occasionally seen at social reintegration workshops and educational programs inside the prison. She never tried to reconnect. Never sent a letter. Ethan never sought to know more about her either. For him, the only way to close that chapter was to understand that what was destroyed from within couldn't be rebuilt with an apology. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's liberation. On an ordinary Sunday, while organizing old boxes in the basement, he found a notebook from the time he helped Victoria with her studies. Inside were scribbled calculations, motivational quotes, and one note in red ink: "Everything solid can melt, even a marriage." He stared at that sentence for a few seconds. He put the notebook back in the box and returned upstairs. The past had its place, and it wasn't there anymore. Ethan's story became a reference in many circles, but for him, the real triumph was outside the headlines. It was waking up in peace. It was working on what he believed in. It was looking back and knowing that, even surrounded by betrayal, he chose to act with truth. Some scars remain forever, but they also serve as reminders that even what seems like the end can be recycled, with courage, patience, and dignity. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.